Good afternoon. I once again welcome you all to this fifth session of the ongoing faculty development program on fundamentals of noble materials. In these sessions, our resource person is Dr. Soumyajyoti Rai from of Technology, Patna. So welcome. In compute dimensional materials, electronic phase tuning, nanosensing, single electron transistor, silicon nanoelectronics, topological insulators, single molecular transistors, superconductivity, and so on. Professor Rai many ongoing research projects in his credit. If you are interested, you can visit his personal website at the IIT websites, and also he has one personal websites also, so you can just Google with his name and you can find it. So I once again welcome and thank Professor Rai for accepting our invitations, and with this I request Professor Rai to kindly deliver his lecture. Please.
Okay. First of all, welcome you all, and thank you especially Dr. Hussain for inviting me and giving me this opportunity of talking on this platform. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me also to interact with so many people, and I hope to have an interesting session with you guys here. So I'll share my screen here, and I hope it is visible here. I'm using WebEx almost up to an year now, so that is why it's looking a little bit different. No? Okay, so I hope my screen is visible here. Is it?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, you can carry on.
Okay, so let me go to the presentation mode. Okay, so again, thank you all to this faculty development program, and today I'm going to talk on this topic of magnetism. So the title of my presentation is Magnetism and Magnetic Materials in Spintronics. So my name is Soumyajyoti Ray, and I am currently working in the Department of Physics at IIT Patna. Now, just before getting into the details, I'll just share maybe 1 minute on the institute. So many of you might be familiar with this, many of you might not be familiar. So this is the second generation IIT, which was established in the year 2008. So our permanent campus is located around 35 kilometers from Patna Airport. So currently we have around 10 departments. So that includes engineering departments, 3 science departments, and 1 humanities department. And around 150 faculties are currently here. And total student strength is around 2,500. So we have BTech, MTech, MSc, PhD. All these programs are running across different departments. Apart from this, we have an incubation center where basically students can incubate their ideas. So if somebody has any idea of product development, or let's say starting a company, that kind of thing, so they can do that in the incubation center. So some funding is provided and mentorship is given, so they can basically incubate their ideas and further develop it towards the development of a product and kind of like making it to the market, let's say to big scale. And recently one technology innovation hub has been established here also. So this is funded by Department of Science and Technology. So here also, I mean, quite a lot of things are going to start here. So currently the focus is on artificial intelligence, natural language processing, these sorts of things. Okay. Now, next, so this is the group which I am heading here. So the name is Quantum Materials Group. So on the left-hand side, you can see these are the people who are currently working here. And on the right-hand side, these are the people who have recently graduated. So these people on the left-hand side, so they're mostly PhD students. So these top 3 row are PhD students, and these bottom 2 are master students. And here, these are mostly the students who have finished recently. So mostly they are working in different places, like some of them are in UK, Canada, US, Korea, and some are also working in companies, things like that. So it's basically a mixture of both industry and academia. Now here basically I'll now go to the topic. So today we'll be talking about magnetism. So we'll get into the details. So we'll talk on various aspects of this thing. So I'll start with some brief introduction, then I'll talk about magnetism, different terminology that is associated with it, units, and then I'll talk about different types of magnetic materials, what are their properties, what is the reason behind that kind of magnetic behavior that is observed in those materials. And then I'll specifically talk about ferromagnetic materials because they have quite interesting properties. And then I'll go to the application part, and towards the end I'll talk about some of the recent applications that have been made possible with the invent of this area called as spintronics. So I'll be talking about GMR structure, that is giant magnetoresistance, tunneling magnetoresistance, these sorts of things. So I'll not talk about too much of any kind of like experimental result, or let's say any research work. I will not be talking too much into research. So mostly we'll be looking at the fundamental aspects of different things. If you have any question, you can stop me, or maybe you can wait until the end, and maybe we can discuss it at that point. Okay, so now, so magnetism is actually quite a old phenomena. So this is the phenomena which deals with the study of magnetic fields and their effects on materials. Now, in our high school, or even let's say in our earlier days, so the idea of magnetism comes with the thing which is called as magnet. So we are used to see something called as a permanent magnet. So that kind of attracts, let's say, any magnetic material. Let's say something like iron or anything like nickel, cobalt, these sorts of things. Okay, like ferromagnetic material, it attracts. Okay, so it has this property that it can attract things. Okay. Now, that has its own application, but the most interesting part of this thing, the magnetism, is that it is closely linked with electricity and the underlying mechanism of electricity and magnetism. It was described almost 100 years back, more than 100 years back, by James Maxwell. Okay, so through Maxwell's equation, he actually made connection between magnetism and electricity and the current that is generated through it. So these are not these are basically interlinked. So there is connection in between them. Okay. Now, our Earth itself is a magnet, and it has a magnetic strength. The field strength is of the order of 1 Gauss. So it is not too large, but it is not zero also. And once in every 2 times 10 to the power 5 years, so it's like in like 100,000 years, this field direction reverses, which means that right now, if the north to south pole direction is along a particular axis, then it will be reversed. So that has some consequences on our natural kind of like artifacts. Like sometimes it can lead to some sort of like effects like flood or even like tsunami, things like that. Okay, so that is the very early idea of magnetism. So this was actually, so the term magnetism, it actually came from this term called as Magnus. So this was a person who was basically handling ships. So from his name, this term magnetism, it came. And William Gilbert was the first scientist who did some mathematical calculations, or let's say he did some systematic investigation to find out what is magnetism. So that actually led to the discovery about Earth's magnetism. And later, actually,
excuse me, sir.
Hello, yes.
You have used homing pigeon. They are having some nanoparticles. Which nanoparticles are present in them?
Okay, wait a second. I think here actually, right? Okay, so that I don't have the exact information, but it will be some ferromagnetic particles. Okay. So it is mostly ferromagnetic. So it could be one of those like iron, nickel, something like that.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So now then after Gauss, then there are these scientists in the 18th century. Frenchman Charles Coulomb, the famous Coulomb's law is under his name. So he also did some work on these things. And then in India, Sushruta was the first one who made use of magnets for surgical purposes. Later on, Hans Oersted, he had found out that electric current can influence the compass needle. So that is the first discovery of the effect of electric current on the magnetic or basically a magnet. Okay, and Michael Faraday, he also discovered that whenever we pass a instant current or momentary current in a circuit, then a nearby circuit, it can either be started or stopped. Okay, so that is the again one kind of interaction that happens between these two. So the motion of a magnet towards or away from the circuit, that can actually either allow passing a current, or let's say the current will be either increased or decreased. So that effect was discovered by Michael Faraday. So these are the early days. Different scientists have made some important discoveries and observations. Now, here are some important quantities which we will first look at. So the first quantity is magnetic moment vector. So this is expressed by either mu or m. So this is the quantity which measures the strength of the magnet. So what is the strength of the magnet? It means that how powerful the magnet is. It means that, let's say, if I apply a magnetic field, the moment or the total magnetization that is generated, this is the quantity which characterizes that. Okay. Now the next quantity is magnetic field strength or magnetizing force. So this is usually denoted by the quantity H. So this is a vector quantity. So M is also a vector quantity. So this is the measure of strength of the externally applied field. Okay. So H is, let's say, the excitation, and M is the result. Okay. Now the third quantity is magnetization, that is capital M. So this is defined as the magnetic moment per unit volume. Okay. And the fourth quantity, which is quite useful here, this is called as magnetic flux density. And it is defined as by the quantity B. So B equals mu naught times H plus M. So this is true for free space. If let's say if we are talking about a magnetic material, let's say solid material, then there will be another mu r, that is relative permeability, which will come into picture. But usually the magnetic flux density B is proportional to the vector H plus M. So the sum of these two. Okay. Now the fifth quantity is susceptibility. So this is defined as M divided by H. So it is kind of a response function. Okay. So it tells us that to which extent a material can be magnetized in relation to a given applied magnetic field. So if the susceptibility is large, it means that even with a very small amount of magnetic field, a large amount of magnetization can be generated. On the other way, if the value of chi is low or susceptibility is low, that means that even with a high magnetic field, it is not possible to create a sufficient amount of magnetization. Okay. So we will see later that, let's say, when you are talking about a ferromagnetic material, then the value of chi will be quite large. Okay. And compared to non-magnetic material, or let's say weakly magnetic material, the value of susceptibility will be quite low. Okay. Now let us look at what are the different sources of magnetic field. So one we have already heard about, that is the bar magnet, or let's say permanent magnet. So it has a north and south pole, which we typically talk about. And from the north pole, the flux lines, we can say that they are coming out and they are coming back to the south pole. So that's how they are completing this entire path. Okay. Now, other than this, artificially, we can also create magnetic field by passing current along a closed circle of loop, or let's say a closed wire. If we have, and if we pass a current, then also that will produce a magnetic field, and usually the direction will be perpendicular to the plane of the current flow. Okay, so in the first picture you can see this. So let me think. Yeah. So here actually you can see that in the first picture that it follows this right hand thumb rule. If the current passes in this direction, then the magnetization will be generated along this direction of this red arrow. Okay. Similarly, we can create magnetic field by using this similar concept, that is, we need to have a closed loop of wire and you have to pass a current, and we can generate magnetic field in this way, like using a loop of wire, or we can create a solenoid by multiple wounds or turns of this wire, and that will give us a very strong or like magnetic field of higher strength along one given direction. Okay. So these are the different sources of magnetic field. So artificially we can create it, or we can simply use a bar magnet. Okay, but we can also use like something called the superconducting magnet, which I'll probably cover in the next lecture. There actually, if we want sufficiently high magnetic field, then we can use those. So that is typically used in, let's say, MRI machines, or even like NMR spectrometer, even like very high powerful magnets. They are also, or accelerators, these are used. Okay, so these magnets are typically not too powerful, but typically they can go up to like few Teslas. Okay, now we'll look at what is the origin of magnetism. So there are three main reasons due to which the magnetism is observed. So one is spin of nucleus, the second is orbital motion of the electrons, and the third one is spin of electrons. Okay, now before getting into this, let us look at what is the spin that we are talking about. So classically, we know that when we talk about spin, we think of a spinning object. Okay, so it means that some object is rotating along its own axis. Okay, so if we simply look at this picture here, let's say we can also think of it as like a Earth and Sun scenario. So here we have, let's say, Sun and we have Earth here. So Earth is rotating around Sun. Earth can also rotate around its own axis. So that is kind of like a spin property. Okay, so this gives us an additional degrees of freedom. Okay, now whenever, let's say, Earth is rotating around Sun, that carries some amount of angular momentum because there is a rotational property. Okay, in addition, whenever it rotates around its own axis, that is the spinning part, it also carries another part of angular momentum that is called as spin angular momentum. Okay, now when we are talking about spin, here this is the spin term that is used in the context of quantum mechanics. Okay, so here we do not exactly say with surety that it is rotating like let's say if the spin is along a particular direction, that means the rotation is happening along this direction, or if the spin is along the other direction, rotation will be happening in the other direction. But it is the intrinsic spin. That means that we don't necessarily see it. Okay, but it is associated with a spin angular momentum. Okay, and it is quantized. So let's say when you're talking about electrons, then these electrons can have two possible orientations. So one is this up orientation or the down orientation. So if we think of electron as a tiny magnet, then we can think of either the electron is aligned in one direction or the opposite. And in both these cases, the angular momentum will be multiple of this quantity, that is h bar, which is basically reduced Planck's constant. So in one case, it will take the value h bar by 2, or in other case, it will be minus h bar by 2. And the magnetic moment will be half g mu b or minus half g mu b. Okay, so this g is the Lambda G factor, which I will come back later. But here, just the key message to remember here is that the spin is the intrinsic property. And for the case of an electron, we have two different configurations of spin that are possible here. Okay, so similarly, nucleus also have a spin. So here, when we are talking about spin, so spin is the quantity which is associated with the magnetic moment. So if there is a non-zero spin, that can give us some magnetic moment. Okay, so that is the quantum mechanical description of magnetism. Now, when you're talking about nuclear spin, then usually it is very slow and have a small contribution to the overall magnetic effect. Okay, so this is the property which is used in nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR. Okay, now when we are talking about orbital motion of nucleus, so that gives rise to orbital magnetic moment. Okay, so this is a measure of the strength of magnetic field that is produced by the orbital angular momentum of an electron. Similarly, the spin part of the electron, this also contributes a magnetic component. So that is basically is coming from the spin part of the electron. Okay, so we'll look into this later in details. So let's say if we are simply looking for the picture of electron, so here let's say electron has two types of motion. One is this orbital motion and other is spin orbital motion of electron. And if the magnetic moment that is coming from the orbital part is mu orbital and the spin part contributes mu spin, then the total magnetic moment that is generated because of this motion will be the sum, vector sum of these two. Okay, now let us look at the orbital magnetic moment. So whenever there is an orbital motion of an electron around the nucleus, so we can think of it is like a current that is flowing in a closed loop. Because why? Because electron is basically a charge, and this charge is flowing along a particular closed loop. So that is why it can be considered as equivalent to this model. Okay, now as per the definition, magnetic moment of such a system, it can be defined as mu will be equal to I times A. Okay, so I is the amount of current that is flowing and A is the area of the loop. Okay, so the direction of mu will be perpendicular to the plane of this. Okay, now here let's say if we are talking about this electron orbit has a radius r, then we can actually get a much simplified expression of this thing. So I can be, this current can be defined in terms of the velocity and the radius, that is ev by 2 pi r, and if we multiply it by the area, we get this quantity evr by 2. Okay, that is the electronic charge and v is the velocity. Now if we equate it to the angular momentum of electron, that is per Bohr's theory, then we know that m here will be equal to n times h bar. M is the mass and h is the Planck's constant. So we are simply equating these two, and after that what we'll get here is that we get an expression for mu will be equal to E times H by 4 pi m. This is called as Bohr magneton. This is the smallest possible orbital magnetic moment that is possible. Okay, so usually whenever we are talking about the magnetic moment of a particular material, let's say it could be iron, it could be copper, it could be uranium, anything. Usually, in order to know how magnetic it is, the magnetic moment should be expressed in terms of this quantity, that is Bohr magneton. So let's say if I'm talking about some material has a magnetic moment of 2 Bohr magneton per unit cell or formula unit, that means I think that, okay, it is quite large. If some material has a magnetic moment of, let's say, 0.005 Bohr magneton mu b formula unit, it is not a very large number. Okay, so that is why this quantity is quite useful. So this Bohr magneton, actually, it tells us what is the orbital magnetic moment that is possible for an electron in the lowest orbit. Is n equal to 1. Okay, now let us look at the spin part. Here, the spin part, or this is the spin property, was first pointed out by these two scientists, Goudsmit and Uhlenbeck, 1925. So they have actually said that this spin angular momentum can be associated with a magnetic moment. So here this is defined with this equation, that is mu s is equal to gs times e by 2m times s. So some of these definitions you have already covered, or let's say have seen earlier, but I'm just recapping these things because some of them will be useful later on. Okay, so the useful part here is that mu s is proportional to the spin angular momentum. Now here, actually, this g is 2 for spin contribution, and g will be equal to 1. So this is the Landé G factor. So again, so I'm not going to discuss it here, but this is, let's say, a factor which can be calculated using the orbital angular momentum and the spin angular momentum and the total angular momentum. Okay, so but simplicity, let's just assume that g equal to 2 for spin contribution and g equal to 1 for orbital contribution. And if we do that, then basically we can have some value of mu s, because E is constant, M is constant. So if we know the value of G, then basically it will be simply proportional to the value of S. Okay. Here one can actually go a little bit deeper into this, and then you can see that total magnetic moment, it will be combined by these two vectors, that is S and L. Okay, so this J vector is a sum of L and S. So that way one can actually even define the total magnetic moment in terms of J. So this is the total angular momentum vector. Okay, so these are the very basics of some of the definitions. Now I'll go to the material part. So here the different magnetic materials, they can have different kind of magnetic orderings. So here are some of the magnetic orderings that are observed. So one is diamagnetism, then paramagnetism, and third is ferromagnetism, antiferromagnetism, ferrimagnetism, and elimagnetism. So each of these magnetic orders are of different types and different nature. They have different origins. So let us look at it. First, we'll talk about diamagnetism. So what is diamagnetism? So this is one kind of magnetic ordering which is observed in certain materials, where the magnetization that is generated in the material is opposite to the direction of the applied magnetic field. So let's say if I apply the magnetic field along plus z direction, in the ideal case, the magnetization vector M will be along minus z direction. Okay, so it is the opposite effect that is produced. So if I have a very high magnetic field, and if the material is a perfect diamagnet, then it will produce a magnetization of equal and opposite value. So the most or let's say strong diamagnet that we observe in nature is the superconductor system, which is, we call it as a perfect diamagnet. Okay, so usually the diamagnetic materials, they are composed, of course, I mean, the reason why diamagnetism is observed is because the orbital cells of the atoms, so we have atoms and they have different electronic configuration. Now these orbital cells, they are completely filled, which means that there is no unpaired electrons. So if there is no unpaired electrons, that means none of the atoms will have any let's say non-zero contribution towards the magnetic moment. Okay, so that is why diamagnetism is only observed such materials where all the orbitals are filled. So some examples are bismuth, copper, lead, and zinc. So if we look at the M versus H curve, so remember that H is the magnetic field and M is the magnetization. Okay, so in this case, if we increase H, M will be negative basically. So M will go down. So usually susceptibility has to be low. Now it can increase linearly here, or it can be just constant. Okay, so with temperature it can be just constant also. So for diamagnetic material, the susceptibility has to be negative. The next type of magnetic ordering is paramagnetism. So this is the most common type of magnetic ordering which is observed. So paramagnetic materials, they exhibit magnetism when the external magnetic field is applied, and when the field is switched up, the magnetization is completely gone. Okay, so this is like an instant effect. So for example, let's say if I have a torch light, I switch it on, I can see something, and let's say in the dark, or let's say at night. And if I switch off the light, then I don't see anything. Okay, which means that the effect of paramagnetism is only present when there is an external magnetic field that is present, which means that external excitation is required. Okay, now what kind of materials demonstrate this particular ordering? So most common materials have paramagnetic ordering. For example, platinum, aluminum, copper sulfate. So many materials you can find which are paramagnets, which means that if you apply magnetic field, you see some magnetism. Okay, now in these materials, they all need to have some unpaired electrons which basically interact with the applied magnetic field, and that is why the magnetization is created. So if we want to look at what actually happens within the material, so we'll look at this picture. So let's think of one paramagnetic material and there is no applied magnetic field. So these arrows represent the magnetic moments. Okay, so let's say each atom is a magnetic moment, or let's say tiny magnet. Now when there is no magnetic field, they are oriented randomly in all possible directions. Now if I want to calculate the total magnetization of this system, then the vector sum will be 0 or very small. Okay, but if I apply magnetic field, then what will happen is that all these tiny magnets, they will try to align along the direction of the magnetic field. Okay, so let's say if I apply magnetic field along this direction, that is upward on this slide, then if the field strength is quite high, all these tiny magnets, they will align along that given direction. Okay, so once it is aligned, then the net vector sum of the magnets, of all these magnets, will be quite large. So that is why in the presence of a magnetic field, a paramagnetic material shows a high magnetic moment. Okay, and if I look at the behavior of susceptibility with temperature, then you can see that it actually shows C by T, this kind of behavior, where C is a constant. So essentially it is 1 over T, that kind of behavior, which means that when the temperature is low, it shows a very high value of susceptibility. Okay, and if temperature is large, then it goes to a very low value. If the value is very large, then it will be almost negligible because it is asymptotically almost increasing. Okay, now what does this tells us physically? Let's say if that temperature is very low, that means that, so here actually whenever you are talking about magnetism, there are two factors which you have to keep in mind. One is applied magnetic field and other is the temperature of the bath. Okay, why? Here the first case I explained that if I apply magnetic field, the moments will align along the direction of the magnetic field. Now you can ask me why? Because there is interaction energy. So each magnet, you can think of it like a magnetic dipole. So whenever I am applying a magnetic field, there is a mu dot B, that energy is involved here. Okay, and that energy will be minimized if direction of the magnet and the applied field, they are parallel. Okay, so that is why whenever I am applying a high magnetic field, the moments will try to align along the direction of the field. Now let's think of what is the role of temperature here. So let's say my system is in this configuration, I have a magnetic field that is applied here. Now if I increase the temperature, what will happen is that, so as I said, that these moments are associated with some atoms. Okay, which means that they will try to vibrate. So this thermal energy will try to kind of disrupt magnetic ordering. So they will try to vibrate, and that will disturb the magnetic orientation. So let's say if I now switch off the magnetic field, and if I increase the temperature, then what will happen is that because of this thermal excitation, now these moments will very fast randomize themselves, and they will go to this kind of configuration. Okay, so here basically these two energy terms that we have to remember, one is mu dot B and other is KBT. So mu dot B is the energy that is coming from the magnetic field, and KBT is the term that is coming from the thermal energy, or let's say our surrounding energy. So because we know that we have a temperature all the time that is non-zero, so KBT is always present. So in any case, whether the magnetic material will be ordered or disordered, that is defined by the relative contribution of these two terms, mu B divided by KBT. So if mu times mu dot B is much larger than KBT, then usually you can expect a specific magnetic alignment. Or contrary to this, if KBT is larger than mu dot B, that means you can expect complete randomness, or let's say no magnetic ordering. Okay, now here, when we are going towards this part that is very low temperature, then you see that susceptibility is increasing. Why? Because when temperature is quite low, that means that the thermal excitation is almost absent. Now, no matter what value of applied magnetic field I have, even if very small amount of field will be able to sufficiently magnetize the material here, which means that even a small amount of magnetic field will be able to completely align the magnetic systems here. That will give me a very high magnetization. Okay, so if I think of susceptibility, that is basically M by H. So at low temperature, even for a very small value of H, I can get a very large value of M. Okay, so that is what I'm getting here. Okay, and if I plot 1 over susceptibility as function of temperature, then this will be a straight line which will be passing through origin. That tells us that this system does not have any critical temperature. Okay, which I'll discuss maybe when I'll discuss about ferromagnetism. So I hope this part is clear. Now let me talk about ferromagnetism. So this is the most interesting, or let's say widely discussed magnetic ordering, that is also like very much useful for applications. So what is ferromagnetism? So this is one particular type of ordering which is observed in some materials which are called as ferromagnetic materials, which exhibit parallel alignment of magnetic moments even in the absence of a magnetic field. Okay. So we see the first difference here. In the case of a paramagnet, we discussed that if there is no magnetic field, then there will be no magnetization. But here, for the case of a ferromagnet, even if there is no magnetic field, it is possible that the material still have a non-zero magnetization. So this term is called as spontaneous magnetization. I'll discuss it now very soon. So there are two distinct characteristics of ferromagnetism materials. One is spontaneous magnetization, and the second one is the existence of magnetic ordering temperature. Okay, so let us first look at spontaneous magnetization. Okay, so here if we look at this graph, this is typical graph of a magnetization versus temperature for a ferromagnet. So this point, that is the origin. Let's say this is close to T equal to 0 or very low temperature. Okay, now here we see that it has a non-zero magnetization. If I increase the temperature, then what happens is that magnetization slowly reduces at a particular temperature, which is called as the critical temperature or Curie temperature. Magnetization, it becomes 0. So when I talk about spontaneous magnetization, I am talking about this value. That means even if let's say material is at a temperature that is lower than the critical temperature, or let's say Curie temperature, the material will still have non-zero value of magnetization. Okay. Now I'll go to the origin of this thing later on. So the second term is basically the existence of magnetic ordering temperature. So as I discussed here, that here we have seen that if I plot 1 by susceptibility as function of temperature, it goes through origin. That means this material does not have any particular ordering temperature. But in the case of a ferromagnet, we will see that this existence of spontaneous magnetization is only possible whenever the temperature is lower than this particular temperature, that is called as critical temperature or Curie temperature. Okay, so what are the examples of this ferromagnetic material? So iron, cobalt, and nickel, these are the very popular ferromagnetic materials. Now, above the Curie temperature, as I said here, magnetization or this spontaneous magnetization becomes 0, which means that the material behaves as a paramagnet. Okay, so below Tc, material behaves as a ferromagnet, and above Tc, the material behaves as a paramagnet. And this behavior is governed by this law called as Curie-Weiss law. Susceptibility is expressed by so I will be equal to C divided by T minus Tc, where C is the basically constant and T is the temperature, Tc is the temperature. Okay. Now let us look at antiferromagnetism. So
Sir, what is C, sir?
C is, let's say, it's a constant, so you can also call it basically it's a constant.
No, what constant?
So you can call it so I think it's called as Curie constant.
Curie constant.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So you have to look at the dimension basically, because chi has the dimension of m by h. Okay, and here this will be of the dimension of basically C divided by temperature. Okay, so C will have the dimension of basically m divided by h times temperature. Okay, so m will be, let's say, EMU per gram, h will be let's say Oersted or Gauss, and T will be Kelvin. So C will have the dimension of these three quantities. Okay. Okay, so now let us look at antiferromagnetism. So what is antiferromagnetism? So this is also similar to antiferromagnetism, but it has a opposite kind of effect that we observe in the case of a ferromagnet. So here basically the magnetic interaction between any two dipoles align themselves antiparallel to each other. So if we look at the ferromagnet, then we see that this magnetic moments, they are all equal and they are lying parallel to each other. Okay, but in the case of antiferromagnet, because of the interaction between the neighboring magnetic moments, what they do is that they align opposite to each other, and if we look at the total system here, then the net magnetization will be 0. There is no magnetic field. Okay, so this is the specific property of antiferromagnet. Now, what are the different materials? So you can see in the case of manganese, chromium, manganese oxide, nickel oxide. So there are many materials which can be antiferromagnetic of nature. Okay. Now, one noticeable characteristics of antiferromagnet is that they attain maximum susceptibility at a critical temperature called as Néel temperature. Above this, the antiferromagnets, they become paramagnet. So if you remember that for ferromagnet, we said that below Tc, the material behaves as a ferromagnet, and above Tc, it behaves as a paramagnet. Here it says that this similar temperature Tc, we call it here as Néel temperature. Okay, so below Néel temperature, it behaves as a antiferromagnet, and above this, it behaves as a paramagnet. Okay, so here we are getting introduced to two different concepts. One is spontaneous magnetization, That means the magnetization which is present when there is no magnetic field. And the second term is called as ordering temperature. So either it is Curie temperature or nil temperature. Okay. Now we'll look into the microscopic origin of this thing. Okay. So before getting into that, let's look at what are the different types of magnetic order this is possible. So depending on like how the moments are orienting among
Excuse me,
themselves.
sir.
Yes.
In the Neel temperature, you are considering same C, and what is here in this C?
So
In the Curie
see,
temperature, there is also C, and here is in the Neel temperature, you are also showing the C. Whether both are
yes.
same thing?
No, these are, see, the value can be different for different materials. Okay, but we'll see that one general equation can be used to define para, ferro, and antiferro. Okay.
That you are saying the Curie constant, and what is
Yes.
this C in the Neel?
You can call it. See, this is a constant basically. C is a constant. So for ferromagnet, we call it as Curie constant, but you can also call it as any constant basically. So this is a constant quantity. Okay. Okay, just give me 1 second. Is this clear? So this is constant quantity. Okay, so the name is not that much important here. Just try to get the idea here first. Okay, so let us first look at why what are these different types of magnetic antiferrometric ordering that are possible. So let's say if we are talking about a cubic crystal, then these magnetic moments can align within themselves in different let's say configurations. So depending on that, we can have either G type, A type, or C type antiferromagnet. Okay, so let's say in this case you can see that this moment is up and the neighboring one is down, and then again this is up, this is down. Okay, however the A type, these two are down, and then the bottom two are up. Okay, so basically eventually the entire structure have to be these moments have to have a configuration that gives a zero magnetization. And here GAC, so they will basically they comprises of different configurations which are possible to attain this scenario. Okay, now the crystal can be BCC, or basically let's say here actually BCC is given. So in this case also you can have this kind of magnetic, let's say the spin configuration that are possible in order to find the antiferromagnetic ground state, and that actually for different materials one can find out that what are the different possibilities. Now not necessarily that all of these configurations will be observed. So let's say for a particular material, one particular kind of these configurations is usually preferred. Okay, so that actually for that one can do calculations or one can do experiment, different sorts of things can be done. Okay, now I told about two different things. One is called a spontaneous magnetization, and the second thing is that the ordering temperature. Okay, so now the main reason why these two properties are coming here is called as exchange interaction. So this interaction can be of different types. So either it is direct exchange or indirect exchange. So they can be further classified into super exchange, double exchange, archequy, anisotropic, things like that. So let us first look at what is exchange interaction. Okay. So for that we will let's say let's look at the Heisenberg Hamiltonian first, then we'll get into the details. So this is the Hamiltonian, which was first pointed out by Heisenberg. So it tells us that, let's say if there are two spins Si and Sj and they are interacting with each other, if the interaction strength is given by this term J, then the Hamiltonian that can define this interaction energy will be Jij means Si dot Sj. Okay, so this, remember, this is a quantum mechanical interaction. So the most closest analog one can find is basically the Coulomb interaction. Okay, so if we want to let's say think of it as a very simple one electron atom scenario, so let's say if we have two electrons and let's say one is having spin Si and let's say other one has spin Sj, and if they are interacting with each other, so it can be shown that depending on basically whether they are located on the same atom or different atoms, they will try to basically minimize the repulsion between them. Okay. These subtitles. Okay, so I hope it is done here. Okay. Just give me 1 second. Oh. Okay. So now it basically tells us that if Si and Sj, they are interacting with each other, and J, if it is greater than 0, then it will lead to ferromagnetism. And if J is less than 0, then it will lead to antiferromagnetism. And J is the quantity which tells us about the strength of the interaction between Si and Sj. Okay, so this is a very simple concept. Now, whenever we are applying a magnetic field, there will be one additional term that will be added to this Hamiltonian, which is nothing other than the interaction between the magnetic field and the spin. Okay, so S dot B term that will be added here. Okay, now let us go back and look at this picture here. Okay, so let's look at this picture here that we have ferromagnet. So these are different magnetic moments which are present. Let's say this is a 2D lattice of a ferromagnet, and these are the different moments which are located at specific sites. Okay, now what I'm telling here is that there is something called as exchange interaction that is existing here. Now, what is this interaction? It is basically the interaction between this spin and that spin, or let's say this moment and that moment, this moment and this moment, third and fourth, fourth and fifth, and so on. Okay. So what it actually is doing is that, let's say Si dot Sj, that is the term, and J is the strength. Okay. Now, whenever there is a ferromagnetic ordering that is existing, so what will happen here is that all these moments, let's say, they are aligned in one particular direction. Okay. Now I slowly switch off the field. Means that there is no external excitation that is existing, right? Now, let's say there is this particular spin, which because of some external influence want to flip. Let's say this spin tries to flip, but just the opposite configuration. Let's say it tries to become down. Okay. Now, if it tries to do that, then what will happen is that since it is connected to this spin, to this exchange interaction, this spin will tell it not to do it, because if it does that, then basically there will be some change in the energy landscape. Okay. Now, this spin is also connected to this spin through exchange interaction. So eventually, this particular spin wants to flip, then all the other spins will somehow get to know this and they will get affected. Okay. So now let us think of this. When we have a particular alignment, let's say all the moments are aligned in one given direction, that means all these tiny magnets are aligned in a particular direction. So the material has a large magnetic moment. Okay. So if this has a large magnetic moment, then that in turn will create something called as a large internal field or molecular field. So I think some audio problem is there. Am I audible now? Is it better? Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's audible. Please carry on.
Okay. So let us think of that all these moments, they are somehow connected through exchange interaction. And if they're aligned in a specific direction, that will give us a large magnetic moment. Now, if it has a large magnetic moment, that means the internal magnetic field that is generated because of that moment will also be quite large. Okay. Now, when this particular spin tries to flip, then that particular field or internal field will be quite larger than the energy that is required to flip this. So this spin will not be able to flip, it will stay. Similar situation will also happen for these other spins. Okay, so that is the reason whenever we have a ferromagnet, because of this exchange interaction, whenever one particular spin or moment tries to flip, this internal magnetic field, it actually stops it from happening that. That is why we get a non-zero magnetization even when the field is off. Okay, So this is a very useful concept actually. Now, this thing is completely absent for the case of a paramagnet. You can ask me why? Because this exchange interaction, that is J times Si dot Sj, this J is 0 in the case of a paramagnet. So there is no J, which means that this spin flips or unclips. This other spin doesn't care about these things. Similarly, this spin also doesn't care whether this spin is flipping. So that is why as soon as the field is switched off, all the moments gets completely randomized. Okay, so you can also think of it like I think in school or in our early, like when we are very kids, we used to hear these stories that like unity, strength, like together we can do things. So here also in the case of a ferromagnet, because of this exchange interaction, somehow all the moments are correlated with each other, and that is why this is a cooperative phenomenon. Okay, and that exchange field, let's say the internal field, is so large that it actually stops the moments to flip. So it is actually kind of a chicken and egg scenario. So it means that whether the field is stopping the magnets, the moments to flip, or the moments are actually aligned, that is why the field is created. So which one is doing whom? So that is not exactly known, but we can say that each, like, because the moments are all aligned in a given direction, that is why the internal field is large. Or simultaneously we can say, because the internal field is quite large, that is why the moments are not flipping. Okay, so this is the main difference between para and ferro. That is why we get a non-zero, or let's say spontaneous magnetization in the case of a magnet. Okay, now the concept comes here. I hope this is clear. Now the point comes here, what is the role of this Curie temperature here? So you see, whatever is the field, that has certain value or certain strength, right? And we have always, I said about energy scale, that is mu dot B and kBT. Okay, so now this B, whatever the internal field, that can have a maximum value for a particular material. Okay, so mu dot B can have a maximum value also. Okay. But kBT, this temperature, if I increase, then kBT can be indefinitely large. So it does not matter how large the internal field is, there will always be a temperature which will give a kBT that is larger than the mu dot B. Okay, so whenever the temperature goes above that particular temperature, this temperature is called as C, above which kBT will be quite larger even than the internal magnetic field. So at that point, the vibrations, or let's say the thermal energy, will be so strong that even the internal field won't be able to sustain this magnetic ordering. Okay, so at that point, this material will turn into a paramagnet. So we will not have any kind of ferromagnetic ordering above that temperature. Okay, so that is why we have this concept called as ordering temperature that is responsible here. Now, this exchange interaction is also responsible for the case of an antiferromagnet. But here, as I said here, that sign of J is less than 0 here. Okay, so actually, if we do, I mean, there are some mathematics which can be done to prove these things, why J has to be less than 0 here, and why J has to be greater than 0 for a ferromagnet. So here it can be shown that for the case of an antiferromagnet, because the J has to be negative, that is why neighboring moments have to be opposite to each other. Okay, so here also the exchange interaction is responsible. Okay, now we'll look at other magnetic orderings, that is ferrimagnetism and helimagnetism. Okay, so what is ferrimagnetism? So this is a phenomena in which the magnetic interaction between any two magnetic dipoles align anti-parallel to each other. But since the magnitude of these dipoles are not equal, the
Dr. Ray?
Yes.
In your figures on page 19 and 20, these arrows representing moments due to single spin, or it is a collection of, means it's a domain spin moments?
See, so far here I am thinking of, let's say it's a single domain. Okay, so you can think of it is like a 2D lattice of spin. Just simply think like that. Because when you talk about a real material, multiple things will come out, like domain walls, boundaries, anisotropy, many things will come out. So we can simply think of it is like a one particular domain, and we have multiple moments which are ordered on a like regular periodic lattice. So it's like a 2D spin lattice. So like a 1D Ising model probably you have heard about. So think of it like a 2D Ising model.
I see, I see. So means this single arrow is representing one spin and not
Yes,
a
one spin.
collection.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay,
S1, S2,
okay,
S3
thank
like
you.
that. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Because all a simple concept helps us to understand these things. Okay. So okay. So now let us look at ferromagnetism. So as you see that here, the ordering is similar to that of an antiferromagnetism, but size of the neighboring moments are not equal, which means that the neighboring moments will not cancel each other immediately. So net, if we look at the total system itself, there will be a non-zero net magnetization. Okay, so this is called as ferromagnetism. This is somewhere in between ferromagnetism and antiferromagnetism. So there are certain class of materials where also this is observed. Now next one is helimagnetism. So what is helimagnetism? So here it is a form of magnetic ordering where spins of neighboring magnetic moments arrange themselves in a spiral or helical pattern with a characteristic turn angle of somewhere between 0 degree and 180 degree. Okay, so let us just look at this very simply. So actually there are certain rare earth materials like let's say holmium or even erbium. So this is naturally observed. So what happens is that let's say we have this picture here. So let's say this is a film kind of thing, and these are multiple, let's say small layers, or let's say single layers of that material. So what is observed here is that the magnetization vectors, it actually changes the direction as we go from one layer to the other. So if you're looking from the top, then we can see vector is actually going through a rotation. So from layer 1 to layer 2, let's say it rotates by an angle theta, layer 2 to layer 3, it rotates by another angle theta, and theta, so on. So finally, over a certain n number of slices, it will complete a total rotation of 180 degree. Okay, so this is kind of a helical ordering. So you can also say that of this magnetization vector, it traces basically like a helix. Basically the cone of an helix or something like that. Okay, so that is why this magnetic ordering is called as helimagnetism. So there are certain spintonic devices where this property is quite well utilized, like in superconducting spintonic system, this is quite well utilized. So this particular property, it actually results from the competition between ferromagnetic and antiferromagnetic exchange interaction. Okay. So now I'll look at the susceptibility versus temperature graph for ferro, para, and antiferro. Okay, so in the case of a ferromagnet, you see that it will. I don't know why these English subtitles are coming here. Can Webex assistant?
Hello.
Hello.
If you take the cursor upon the subtitle, at the right side you can see above right side a cross. You can just cross it. Close it. This one. Just you scroll the cursor above the text, and at the right side, upper corner, you see a cross.
So you see this subtitle is closed captions. It is closed now, I think.
Yeah. Here we are not seeing it.
Okay. But I think somebody is actually still seeing it. Okay. So I hope it is visible now. Okay. So now if I plot basically 1 over susceptibility over temperature, then this is a quite useful plot. So here you see for A, that is the paramagnet, it actually goes through T equal to 0. And for B, that is the ferromagnet, it has an intercept, that is positive intercept on the temperature axis. So this is the critical temperature or Curie temperature. And for C, it is called as the antiferromagnet. So it has an intercept on the negative side. So this is called as a nil temperature. Okay. So very simply from this diagram, we can say, just looking at the susceptibility, 1 over susceptibility versus temperature graph, whether the material is para, ferro, or antiferro. Okay. Now, this is actually common question which comes in exam, or even like I usually ask students that what is the order of transition? So whenever a ferromagnet becomes paramagnet, what is like there's a phase transition that is happening, right? So basically material has a critical temperature. That means there has to be some kind of a phase transition. This is a second order phase transition. Okay. And what is the order parameter here? So this is the spontaneous magnetization. So if you look at here, this is the spontaneous magnetization, which actually goes to 0 at Tc. And the first derivative of that, which will be basically susceptibility, that will diverge at this point. This is a second order transition that happens when a ferromagnet turns into a paramagnet. Okay. Now, let us look at the domains. So some of you have already pointed out. So domains are actually domains lie at the heart of ferromagnetism. So it's Weiss who first proposed the theory of domains. Okay. So a magnetic material, or let's say magnetic material, which we are commonly using here, it is consisted of a number of distinct microscopic regions which are termed as domains, each of which was saturated in a different direction. So here, if you look at this particular diagram, so this is a complete magnetic material, and here you can see that there are these small boundaries or small boxes which are separated by boundaries, and within each of these boundaries there are these vectors which are, let's say, the magnetization direction that is representing. So there are multiple domains, and within each of these domains is a specific direction of magnetization, and they're separated by domain walls. And depending on how these domains are going to behave in the presence of a certain magnetic field at a certain temperature, the magnetization will take that certain value. So the domains actually play a major role here. So we'll look into this. So the total energy of the domains, it is basically coming from the sum of exchange energy or magnetic field energy. So exchange interaction I explained already. And there is anisotropic energy, domain wall energy, and magnetostrictive energy. These are different energy components which are responsible here. Now, what is exchange energy? So it is the interaction energy that makes the adjacent dipoles to align themselves. That is known as exchange energy. So it establishes a single domain structure in a ferromagnetic material, and it is the energy required in assembling the atomic magnets into a single domain, and this work is stored as the potential energy. So as I said here, so it's basically SI.Sj, or you can think of like if this big magnet is represented by some particular spin, you can also think of it like that. So eventually, if these two spins are parallel, then basically it will reduce or minimize the energy. Okay, so this is exchange energy. Now, what is anisotropic energy? So any material has some sort of directionality, or let's say direction dependent magnetic property. Why? Because any material has a certain crystal structure, which means that it has some preferred and non-preferred direction. Okay, so if I want to align the material, or let's say magnetic moments in a given direction, then I will either face some rejection, or I will probably find it more easier to do it. Okay, so in some case, basically I have to apply excess amount of energy to magnetize the specimen along the hard direction over that required to magnetize the specimen along easy direction. Okay, so this is called as the crystalline anisotropy energy. So it is basically the difference of energy that is required to magnetize the material along the hard direction over the easy direction. Okay. Now, magnetoanisotropic energy is defined as the minimum amount of energy required to detect magnetic moment of a crystal from the easy to hard direction. So easy direction is the one that is easier to magnetize, and hard direction is the one where basically large amount of magnetic field is required to magnetize. Okay, or let's say align in the different direction. Now, what are the sources of this anisotropy? So it could be because of the shape, it could be because of the magnetocrystalline anisotropy, it could be because of stress. Okay, so this could be different reasons which can contribute to this particular component. Now let us look at domain wall energy. So domain wall is something that I said that whenever we have domains, that means there will be some wall which separates them. Okay, so adjacent domains are separated by something called as domain walls, and the entire change in spin direction between domains, it does not occur in one single jump across a single atomic planar, and rather takes place in a gradual way extending over many atomic planets. Okay, the idea is very simple here. So if we look at this diagram here, you see the magnetization vector here is downward here. And here in this particular domain, the magnetization direction is, let's say, horizontal. Now, here is the domain wall. Now, of course, just like that, this magnetization direction cannot change. Okay, so there has to be some continuous process over which this change of magnetization direction has to happen. Okay, so that is, and that happens through something called as domain wall. So it is not a single layer or say one just in boundary, rather it can be of certain thickness and certain, let's say, width, okay, over which this gradual change of the magnetization direction it happens. Okay, so as it says, the magnetic moments in adjoining atoms, they change direction continuously across the boundary between domains. So here you can see, let's say in one domain the moments are down, in the neighboring domain it is up. Now, changing the direction from down to up, it has to rotate by small angles. That way, basically, this continuous change will happen over something called as the domain wall. Okay. Now, there are three different types of these domain walls. So one is called as Ising type domain wall. Next one is called as block type, and other is nil type. So these block and nil, they are quite popular. So what it says is that when an applied external magnetic field is applied, the boundary between the domains shift and the domains rotate. Both of these effects cause a change in the material's dimension. Okay. Sorry, excuse me. Now, magnetization can be explained by considering two related mechanisms. One is the rotation of magnetic moments and the movement of domain walls. This is nil wall and block wall. Okay. So what is the difference here? So in the case of block wall, you can see that these moments, they actually rotate along the plane. Okay, so if there is a domain wall, so these moments will kind of like rotate along different planes. So if I make different slices, at each slice it will rotate by a small amount, and that way it will reach the certain magnetization direction, whichever is possible, the next domain. Okay, so I will answer all your questions. So I think let us just continue for the moment. I'll explain the answer the questions at the end of this talk. Okay, thank you. Now for the nil type, here the change in the direction of magnetization, it happens across the plane. So if you remember that I explained this thing for helimagnetism, that the direction of the magnetization vector, it changes by little angle along each of these slices. So you can also think of, if this is a domain wall, there are multiple small slices which are present here, then this magnetization vector, it rotates by a small amount in order to reach the certain magnetization orientation which is present in the next layer. Okay, so this particular kind of orientation is similar to that of block type wall. So each layer, this layer basically magnetization is rotating in each layer by a small angle. So this is along the plane. Here it is going across the plane. So it is perpendicular to the plane, it is rotating. Okay, so that is the only difference here between block type and nil type. Now let us look at the fourth component, that is magnetostrictive energy. So when the domains are magnetized in different directions, they will either expand or shrink. That leads to the deformation of the material when magnetized. This phenomenon is called as magnetostriction. So as you see that whenever these domains are either increasing in size or decreasing in size, so there will be some amount of stress or strain that is generated with it. Okay, which means that there will be change of shape of the material. So this energy which is associated with it is called as magnetostrictive energy. Okay, so this deformation is different along different crystal directions, and this change in dimension depends on the nature of the material. For example, if the material is very hard, the change will be different. If the material is soft, the change will be different. Okay, but it is related to the actual physical strain that is generated in the material. Now let us look at how does the domain structure changes and what is the role of it in the hysteresis loop. So let's say when it is in the non-magnetized case, then there are, let's say, 4 domains which are of equal and identical size, and the magnetic moments are cancelling each other. Okay. So there is no net magnetization. Now if I apply certain magnetic field, let's say, along this given direction, then one of the domains will grow in size because it is more favorable for this particular domain to grow, the magnetization to grow or increase. The other domains will be shrink at the cost of it. Why? Because the net volume of the material is fixed. Okay, domains will start growing. Now, eventually, if it goes on for some time, then other domains will shrink and it will also lead to domain rotation, which means that the magnetization vector will rotate in order to, let's say, go to the lowest energy configuration. Okay. So this domain rotation, it is basically the final state by applying very strong fields. And if the field is very large, then it will saturate the magnetization, but creating a single domain structure. So if this field is very large, then what will happen is that only one of these domains will cover the entire specimen, and these other domains will occupy very small volume. So we can call it as a single domain state. Now let us look at how does it correlate with the hysteresis curve. Okay, so let's say when I am applying the magnetic field, so hysteresis curve is nothing other than the magnetization versus H field curve for a ferromagnet. So we see some magnetic hysteresis here. Okay, so let us first look at the virgin branch. This is the M versus H curve. When the field is 0, there is no net magnetization. So, sorry, excuse me. So there is no net magnetization when there is no field. So I am assuming that material does not have any history. Now I am slowly increasing the field. Domains are starting grow. And here you can see this is the part where the growth of domains it happens. So here the slope is largest. And above certain magnetic field, saturation will happen, which means that domains will not grow any further in size, which means that the magnetization of the material cannot increase beyond this value. This is called as a saturation state. If we look at B versus H curve, okay, so this B is also proportional to the saturation magnetization. You see that when the field is, let's say, unmagnetized, then this net contribution of these 4 domains are cancelling each other. Slowly we are increasing the field. So 2 are getting shrink, 2 are getting larger. Then there is 2 which are growing earlier, they are growing further, and slowly they will grow, and eventually it will become a single domain state. And there will reach a point when the domain will have only one single magnetization direction and it cannot increase beyond this value, which means that this material reaches saturation at this point. Okay, so that is how the domain growth can be related to the magnetization curve, or let's say the hysteresis curve. Now let us look at the hysteresis curve, which we typically observe for the case of a ferromagnet when we measure. Okay, so this is the B versus H curve, but you can also M versus H, which will have a similar kind of shape. Okay, so now here we have this pink dotted line, that is the virgin branch. So we are starting from H equal to 0, and then we are slowly increasing, and then we are reaching this point, which is called as point A, that is the saturation state. Okay, so here we are reaching almost a single domain state. Now, when we are reversing this path, that is from A to B, when we are going, then it does not follow the same path. Earlier at H equal to 0, B is also 0. But now, H equal to 0, B is non-zero, which means that the material has a non-zero magnetization. So this is what we are calling it as a spontaneous magnetization. Okay. Now, if we follow along this path, this point is also called as retentivity, which how much magnetization it is retaining when the field is completely 0. Now, from B to C, if we are going, then we'll see that in order to make the material not zero magnetic, or let's say in order to make the magnetization 0, we have to apply a negative magnetization. Okay, so this is called as coercivity. If we follow along this path from C to D, it will follow another basically one branch of this hysteresis curve. And please give me 1 second. Excuse me. Okay, so here also point D, it will reach saturation. It is in the opposite direction. So if you remember that spins, they can either go along this direction or the opposite to that. So in case A, let's say they are up, at point D, they are down. Okay. Now from D to E, if I go, it will just reverse whatever has happened in this blue line. So point B can be thought of as point E in the case of this purple branch. And then point F, if I want to make the magnetization 0, I have to apply positive. Okay. And then if I go along this, then I'll reach the saturation. So if you continue this path, you will see that you will always reach saturation. But if you want to reach the zero magnetic state, then you have to apply either a positive magnetic field or a negative magnetic field. Okay. So that is how you can completely demagnetize a ferromagnet. Okay. So now this particular behavior is called as hysteresis, and this is the reason why a ferromagnet can be used for memory application, sensor, and many things. If we think of a paramagnet, then it will have only this dotted line. So when I apply the magnetic field, magnetization will increase, it will reach saturation, and then if I switch off the field, it will come back along that particular path itself. Okay. However, for the case of a ferromagnet, because we have this exchange interaction, that is why we see this kind of hysteresis. Okay. So now here is a different. Hello.
Just before this slide. Now, here is the coercivity and retentivity. Whether this coercivity and retentivity is taken for the only upper portion, and in concern to the saturation magnetization, it will consider the full from positive to negative is taken in calculation point of view.
Okay. See, in the ideal case, okay, let's say you have some magnetic material. You have measured the magnetization, or let's say the M versus H curve. Okay. Then you have got this kind of hysteresis loop, right? So if the system, let's say you have measured it with a squid magnetometer or have DSM or anything, okay, if the material does not have any background field, or if the not material basically, if the system does not have any background field, which means that if I am saying H is 0, that means the system does not have any field at all. Okay. If I can confirm this, at the same time, if I know for sure that the material was at a completely demagnetized state when I am starting the measurement, then point B and point T will be identical. Okay. If not, what you can do is that you can take an average of these two and you can take the half. Does it answer your question?
No, sir, I want to ask now. Whenever we want to calculate, we calculate for the 50% only for the coercivity and the retentivity. But for the saturation magnetization, whether we take the full length of that loop.
So actually, you are talking about the value of saturation magnetization or the field?
Value of saturation magnetization in the calculation point of view, coercivity, retentivity, and the saturation magnetization. These values are to be taken.
Yes, yes. So see, I don't know which graph or figure you are talking about, but usually, let's say if you have a hysteresis curve, okay, so you have to look at that particular region where the magnetization is not changing much. So you see here, beyond certain value of field, if I look at the value of magnetization, the magnetization will not change much. That will be the point which I can call it as the saturation point. So the value of magnetization at that point will be called as saturation magnetization. So let's say you look at this point here, you can see the cursor here, right? This in the arrow point. So from this point to this point, there is clearly an increase in the magnetization, right? From here to here also, there is a clear increase in the magnetization. But if I keep on increasing the field here, so here actually the figure does not show it, but if I increase the field here, and then if I decrease the field here, I will see the onward path and then backward path, they will lie on top of each other. Which means that
A and D, if I consider A and D.
No, not A and B. It's actually above A, I'm saying. If I keep on, so here you see the magnetization was measured only up to certain value of magnetic field, right? But if I measure it up to a much higher value of magnetic field, okay, so this blue line will go much further beyond A. Okay? And then from that point, if I come back, there we will see that this blue line, whenever I'm going forward and I'm retracing back, they're going basically falling on the same line.
Okay.
Okay. So whenever that will happen, so whichever point onward that phenomena will happen, I can call it that is the saturation point. That value, I mean that point, whatever value of magnetization you will see, we can call it as saturation magnetization. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So I'll discuss it later after I finish the talk. So I don't have a data here right now. Otherwise, I would have actually shown you.
Okay, sir. Continues.
Okay. Okay. So now let's say here are different types of hysteresis loop which are observed for different materials. So the first one is basically is magnetization versus B. So here you can see the size of the loop is quite large, which means that it retains a large fraction of the saturation field when driving when basically the driving field is removed. Okay. Yeah. So you see the value of saturation magnetization here is this much, and when the field is removed, it does not fall much from the saturation magnetization. Okay, so this kind of loops, or let's say the materials which are showing this kind of hysteresis loop, they are desirable for permanent magnets, magnetic recording, and memory devices. Why? Because they have a large value of this spontaneous magnetization, which means that they can retain memory by quite a large value. Okay. Now here actually for the second case, you can see the loop is little bit slimmer than the first case. So here the area of hysteresis loop is related to the amount of energy dissipation upon reversal of the field, which I think you know already. Now let's look at the third case. So here this loop is very slim, which means that only a small amount of dissipated energy is repeatedly used in reversing the magnetization. So this kind of material which show this type of slim hysteresis loop, they are desirable for transformer design motor cores because that will minimize the energy dissipation in the presence of alternating fields associated with the AC electrical applications. Okay, so even for sensing application also, sensor design also, this kind of slim magnetic field or this slim hysteresis loop is preferable. Okay, so although all ferromagnets show hysteresis, but depending on some materials will have a larger size and some materials will show a smaller size. So that will categorize which type of application they are desirable for. Now there are two other types which actually I explained a little bit. So one is hard magnet and other is soft magnet. So hard magnet is basically materials which retain their magnetism and are difficult to demagnetize. They are called as hard magnetic materials. So these materials retain their magnetism after even the removal of the applied magnetic field. Hence, these materials are used for making permanent magnets. Okay, so that is the same thing which I explained, that if I am going to the zero state, still it will have a very large amount of magnetism. So if I want to make it zero, then I have to do quite a lot of work. Okay, so that is why these are used for permanent magnet design. On the contrary, soft magnets have a very small loop, which means that they can be useful for making temporary magnets or even sensor, these sorts of things. Now, there are different effects actually which are associated with it. So one is called as magnetocaloric effect. So this is commonly seen as the reversible heating and cooling of magnetic solids upon their exposure to a varying magnetic field. So some materials, they actually produce heat, which means that the energy is basically released in the form of heat whenever the basically material is either magnetized or demagnetized. So that is the phenomena called as magnetocaloric effect. Then magnetostrictive effect, which I said earlier, that in the presence of the domain growth or rotation, some amount of strain is generated in the material and that is associated with some energy. So each of these have different applications. And then magnetostrictive effect, magnetoresistive effect. So here, the electrical resistance of a material, it changes in the presence of a magnetic field. So that is a very useful phenomena, and this is quite very much useful. Actually, this has already widespread applications in our computer, hard disk, and all these things. Magnetoresistive effect. Okay. Okay, so now I'll just talk about few more slides and then I'll not take too long. Let's say now I'll go to the application part. So what is the application? So application of magnetic materials are everywhere, in computers, in electrical distribution, transformer, sensor, food, medicine, storage, equipment, communication, security, drug delivery, cancer therapy, medical, diagnostics, everywhere magnetism is used somewhere or other. Okay, for example, simply you can think of like an MRI scan. Okay, it basically collects the magnetic information of your body, and whenever nothing works, basically your doctor usually tells you to do a MRI scan. Okay, so you can think of like up to which level this magnetism can be useful. So here this picture is of a magnetic hard disk. So now of course you all have SSDs, so this is not how it looks like now, but even excuse me, few years back it used to be like that. So these are basically perpendicular, or let's say magnetic recording devices, and there are multiple magnetic layers which used to store each bit. Okay, so it used to rotate at a certain RPM, like 5,400 RPM or 6,000 RPM or 4,800 RPM, and this is the read head which used to read the information, and that is basically a magnetoresistive device. Okay, so I'll very briefly explain this. So because of lack of time, I could not explain it, but this is a very interesting topic, and Nobel Prize was awarded in the year 2007 because of this discovery. So as I said, it can have various applications like medical applications, and yeah, like different diseases, for curing them they are used. Okay, so automotive, mining, things like that. So let me just go to this part here, magnetoresistance. Okay, so what is magnetoresistance? So the resistance of a conductor, it changes when placed in an applied magnetic field. So this effect is called as magnetoresistance. So very simply, you know that what is the origin of resistance? Let's say we apply a voltage. So carriers or electrons, they move within an wire, or let's say material, and they suffer some collision. Okay, so higher the collision, higher will be the resistance. Okay, so that is why we face resistance. But in the case of a magnetoresistance, it is the magnetic field which essentially either enhances or reduces the resistance. Okay, so that property is very much useful in designing a sensor. So I'll just show you one particular structure. So this is called as giant magnetoresistance structure. So what is this? So it is a very simple structure. This is a trilayered structure. So we have a ferromagnet, non-magnet, and a ferromagnet. Usually this non-magnet is a metallic layer, so you can think of it like iron, copper, iron. Okay, now as it is a ferromagnet, so it will have a given magnetization direction, which is the preferred one, and for this one also it is preferred. Now let's say these two ferromagnetic layers, they are aligned in the same direction. Now let's say if I'm trying to pass a current from the left side to the right side, so the electrons have to pass through all the three layers, right? Now, since these layers are magnetic, so the spin part of the electron will also be responsible, or let's say they will also play a role here. Okay, so in the case of conventional current conduction, they don't play a role. But let's say if the spin of the electron, so let's say I have an unpolarized source of electrons which are used to carry the current. Okay, now at this point, let's say if a given electron has up spin, so it will, let's say, enter here. You will see that, oh, this ferromagnet also has similar kind of magnetization as that of me. So it will find it energetically favorable. It will easily come here. It will pass through this. And the second layer also, it will see that, oh, this magnetization is also similar to as that of mine. So it will easily pass through. Okay. Now, if you think of the down spin here, you will see that magnetization of this layer is opposite to that. So which means that the number of available states of this, let's say, spin will be less here, or let's say the exchange field that is faced by this spin will be high here. Which means that if I look at the output here, the number of up spins will be much larger in number. Why? Because they face very less amount of scattering, or less resistance here. But the down spins, they will face a higher amount of resistance. Okay. So that is why the output current will essentially be spin polarized. Overall, I can say that output current will be mostly contributed by the up spins. Okay. Now let us look at opposite of this. That is when these two magnets are aligned opposite or anti-parallel to each other. In that case, what will happen is that, let's say it's an up spin, so it will see that first layer, okay, same direction, aligned magnetically, happy, it will cross it, but the second layer has a opposite magnetization direction. So it will find quite a lot of resistance here. We look at the downspin here. It will face a lot of resistance here in this layer, but if it can cross this, then it will find an easier path here. Here, the output, both the up and down spin will be lesser in number because they will face scattering, or let's say higher resistance in one of these two layers. So essentially, if I look at the total resistance of this structure, here the resistance of the structure will be less. So the RP, which is called as the resistance of the structure in the parallel configuration, will be small. And RAP, that is the resistance of the structure in the anti-parallel configuration, will be larger. Okay. So if you look at, I'm not doing anything, just I'm switching the direction of the magnetic field here, or the magnetization direction of one of these layers. And that is creating two different specific resistance states. So one is RAP, or let's say anti-parallel resistance, and other is parallel resistance. One is low and other is high. So this specific feature is used for designing our basically like a on-off kind of operation. So you can design a logic circuit where this high resistance state and low resistance state can be considered as an on-off state. Okay, so this discovery was first made by Professor Albert Fartt in 1988 on iron chromium layer, and Peter Grunberg in the year 1989 on iron chromium layer, so around the same time. So they have actually observed this nice graph. So this
Excuse me, sir.
change.
Sir, actually, we are almost, time
So
is
give
almost
me-
over. So kindly,
Yeah, give me 1 or 2
consider this.
minutes. I'm finishing. I'm almost
Sure,
close.
sure.
Okay. So this is
Sure.
very interesting. That's why I covered actually. Okay. Okay. So here, if you look at this graph here, so you see the maximum resistance is here, and the let's say the lowest one is here. So the change of the resistance between the parallel and anti-parallel state can be of the order of 80%. Okay, so this is why they are called as giant magnetic resistance, or the resistance change can be very large. Okay, so on this discovery, actually Nobel Prize was awarded in 2007. Okay, so similarly, we can think of something called as tunneling magnetic resistance, where this metallic layer will be replaced by a insulating layer, and the current will be conducted. Tunneling mechanism, and if the layer thickness is small, means the tunneling probability will be higher, and if the thickness is larger, probability will be smaller. And the same logic will apply, that we can create a parallel and anti-parallel configuration. But the advantage of this TMR structure is that in this case, the resistance ratio between the parallel and anti-parallel cases are much higher compared to the GMR case. Okay, so this technology was first actually discovered in IBM by Professor Stuart Parkin. So he worked quite extensively on this thing. So in I think 2000 they discovered. By 2002 they have actually made it as a product, and by that time, within 3 or 4 years, it came into market. And in most of the computers, this is used as magnetic lead heads. I mean TMR sensors. So this spin property of magnets, it actually forms something called as the area of spintronics. Okay, so as you know that there is something called as Moore's law, which tells us that the number of transistors that is required to design a silicon chip, it is doubling every 2 years. So that is why there is a downtrend, which means that there is a boundary at which that further scaling will not be possible. So this is one of the possible, like one of the areas or one of the direction where this technology scaling can further happen. So this is called as spintronics, the spin electronics. So if we compare these two, electronics and spintronics, so in the case of electronics, it deals with the charge of electrons. In spintronics, it deals with the spin of electrons. Okay, so this is a classical property, this is a quantum property, and actually the information is processed here by charge, but here actually spintronics, it can have much more advantages. For example, it can reduce the computing power and the storage speed, and there are some future proposals like in quantum computer, quantum communication, that can be possible if this spintronics can be made further. Okay, so with that, I will finish here. So here are some of the references which can be useful. So yeah, so this is the book by Professor Stephen Blundell, and there are some of these nice papers. Which one is published by this Professor Wang in Nature, and then Albert Hoover. So there are some of these papers which you can have a look at. And thank you for your time and attention. Okay, and sorry for taking longer than what was expected, and but I hope that it was useful. So if you have any question, please ask me now.
So thank you, Professor Rai. So it was very nice lecture, and basically there was a lot of basics of the topics magnetism in nanomaterials or novel materials in lower dimensions. So it's some kind of informative and very effective also, because we have audience from almost all areas of research field. So it's effective, I guess. So I see some questions in chat box. So if you can read and give short answer,
Give me
then
a
it's
second. So I am. Let me read chat box. Okay, just give me 1 second.
can you see it?
Yes, I can see it. Okay. Okay, so I'll start from the last one probably. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay. English subtitles, fast breaking, clear audios,
Why domain walls have a finite thickness? I see.
Why it cannot be sudden as in case of antiferrometric materials that the neighboring spins are just opposite. Okay, very good question actually. Okay, so you see, so this is the problem. I don't have a paper like board to show it. Okay, so let us think of that we have two domains, two neighboring domains. Okay, now we have a domain wall separating them, right? So let's say in one domain the magnetization vector is up, in the neighboring domain the magnetization vector is down. Okay, now over the domain wall this up vector has to rotate so that it can reach the down configuration for the next domain. I hope up to that is clear, right? So this is let me see. Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, so let's say this is the picture basically. So I have one domain, another domain, and in between this is the domain wall. Okay, so within the domain wall, basically, I have to have some sort of rotation like this in order to go to this state. Okay, now in reality, if we let the system to do this process naturally, what will happen is that it will do this rotation over an infinite length scale. Okay, which means that the domain wall will increase in size indefinitely. So it will go on and on and on. Okay, why? Because actually, if we calculate the cost of or the energy cost that is required to flip, let's say this pin to that spin, let's say up to down, the energy cost, if we see the total energy cost, and then if we split it between n number of rotations, then we see that if n goes to infinity, then the energy cost per rotation will be infinitesimally smaller. So system naturally wants that. That means it will want to flip very, very slowly, which means that the domain wall will be indefinitely larger. So that is the natural way system wants. But it does not happen because of one interesting factor that is called as magnetocrystalline anisotropy. It actually stops that from happening, which means that the domain walls cannot grow indefinitely. So this anisotropy stops it. Okay, so that is why the domain walls don't increase indefinitely. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so domain wall rotates, or it seems to be changing very fast. Actually, domain wall, it does not rotate. The magnetization across the domain wall, it changes. Okay, so let us think of this, that this is a domain wall. Okay, and I have multiples of thicknesses here. So can you see these different pages are basically multiple thicknesses. Now on one page, it is, let's say, like this. On the next page, it rotates by a small amount. On the next page, it rotates by a small amount. Okay, so the domain walls actually does not rotate, but over multiple slices of the domain wall, it actually makes the rotation. The magnetization vector makes the rotation. Okay, so that is how the basically domainal, I mean the magnetization vector rotation, it takes place. And does magnitude of magnetic moment of its spin remains same or different in helimagnet? Yes, actually it will stay same. So if we just think of it, it's basically the magnetization vector, it just stays of the same magnitude, but it rotates the direction. Okay. Visible. Okay, more informative feedback, send feedback, session informative session. What is the difference between magnetoresistance, giant and tunneling magnetoresistance? Okay, so it will take 2 minutes. Can I have 2 minutes? Giant and tunneling magnetoresistance. Hello.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm saying this question will take a little bit of time. Okay, so I'll just go back to the slide again. I think that was the last
Yes.
question. Okay, so I'll go back to the slide again. I think let me see the screen here. Okay, see, in the case of giant magnetoresistance, what happens is that so the essential structure is same. We have ferromagnets and a non-magnetic layer. So for the case of a giant magnetoresistance, I have one ferromagnet and a second ferromagnet, but the non-magnetic layer has to be metallic. It is non-magnetic. It could be copper, it could be chromium, something like that. Okay. But in the case of tunneling magnetoresistance, this non-magnetic layer will be insulating layer. So something like magnesium oxide, or let's say Al2O3 like alumina, something like that. Okay. It's not only the material property that is changing here, but it also essentially changes the way it conducts. So if it is metallic, that means that here the current can easily pass through it, because you know the metals have higher level of conductivity and free electrons, all sorts of things like that. But in the case of a tunneling magnetoresistance, since this layer will be insulating, so there will be no available states around a certain energy gap around the Fermi level. Okay, because there is a gap there. Right? Which means that the only way they can travel the states from one ferromagnet to another ferromagnet is through tunneling. Okay, and the tunneling probability, this will go as by this factor, that is exponentially it will decrease with the thickness. Okay, so if so here actually, let's say if M1 is my first ferromagnet, so if I extract the spins from this surface here, okay, so I hope this pointer, laser pointer. So let's say if I extract the spins from this point, the Fermi level here, then it will be essentially spin polarized. Okay, 100%. Now they will tunnel through this layer, and when they will reach here, they will see whether this particular material also has available states of the same type. So let's say both are up. Okay, so means that up spins are coming here. Now, if this is also aligned in the same magnetic alignment is same as that of this, then the spins will find large number of available states. It means that they will easily tunnel. Right? But if the magnetization directions are opposite, which means that this is up and this is down, then up spins will tunnel, but then they will see that there is no available states. Let's say very little number of available states are available, or up spins, which means that they will face a very large amount of resistance here. Okay, so the essential total resistance of the structure will be quite large, even in the anti-parallel case for this structure also. Okay, so parallel case, that both are up or both are down, it does not matter. The current will pass very fast because the tunneling will happen very fast, subject to the condition that the thickness of this layer is very small. Okay, so here also in the parallel case, the resistance will be very small, anti-parallel case resistance will be large. Okay, and in the case of here, you can see the thickness of this non-magnetic layer is quite important. Okay, so here you see that iron layer has the same thickness, that is 3 nanometer, but the chromium layer has 1.8, 1.2, 0.9. So if I reduce the thickness of the non-magnetic layer, that means that the magnetization ratio, or the difference between the resistance of parallel and anti-parallel state, that is increasing actually. Okay, so there is something called as interlayer exchange coupling, which can be explained also. But the key message is that the thickness of the non-magnetic layer, whether it is metallic or non-magnetic, that has to be very small in order to have a higher GMR or TMR value. Okay. Okay, so I hope that answers the question. I don't see any other question. Okay, here. So any other question from anyone? No. Okay. So
Okay. So it was nice although we are, a little bit ahead of times. But anyway, so it's very nice lecture, and I also want to remind the participant that you will have also scope to interact with Professor Rai again on day after tomorrow. Okay,
Yes.
so thank you very much, Professor Rai. Let us stop this session here. We will meet tomorrow once again at 10:30 a.m. So all the participants, please join 15 minutes before the sessions. Okay, so that we can start session properly. So till then, goodbye. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Rai.
Okay, thank
See
you.
you
Thank you.
again.
Okay, okay. I'm leaving. Okay. Yeah.